Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Chernise Neo, and today I'll be telling you the story of how I started an artisan bakery that trains and employs refugee women. The name of that bakery is Proof Bakery, and we're based in Coventry. And now, I'm not a refugee, and so I'm actually a Singaporean woman from a terribly boring middle class background. So, how in the world did I end up in Britain running an artisan bakery and working with refugees? You're about to find out. So, I want to start by telling you quite a bit about my family and my childhood, because I think that has really strongly influenced who I am today. And hopefully, you'll be able to see that in some of the things that I say. So, this is my extended family. And not only my aunts and uncles, but also my grandaunts and granduncles, and their children and their grandchildren, and so on. We get together in Singapore and take a huge group photograph every Chinese New Year, which takes forever to organize. And if you are especially sharp-eyed, you might be able to spot me. I'm somewhere in the back row. Um, and one of the things that you should know about my family is that they're food mad. I think I realized this at about the age of 9, when it slowly dawned on me that when my classmates at school went on vacation, they would do things like go to the beach or go to the Sea Life Center. And my family tend to plan our vacations around meals, so around the things that we'd like to eat and the places that we'd like to go to eat them. And the things that we do in between meals are just the sort of stuff that fills time until the next meal. And we spend lots of time, very boringly, if you ask my husband Sam, dissecting the meals. So, what is good about them? What could be better? And later on in my adult life, I've started to cook and, of course, to bake. But my first qualification, I suppose, to be in the food industry was really as an eater, as someone who developed quite strong opinions about food early on and had to explain them to my family. The other thing about my family is that all of my grandparents' generation were entrepreneurs. One way or another, they all had little businesses. And I found this out because one Chinese New Year, about 6 years ago now, I decided that I would spend some time taping video interviews with my grand aunts and grand uncles because, they wouldn't be around forever. So I asked them about their memories of the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded Singapore, about what they did for work, and so on. And one of the things that they all said was that they had owned food businesses. One had owned a noodle stand, another had owned a biscuit factory, another made curry puffs, which are sort of, imagine a Cornish pasty but filled with curry and deep fried. It's very delicious. Anyway, so that was all in my family history, that history of hard graft in food, having your own business to support your family. And actually, my grandparents' generation were good at it. So good, in fact, that they were able to give their kids a better life. So my parents and my aunts and uncles all had a bit more education than their parents had. And they went into what were considered quite sort of comfortable and respectable careers as bankers or engineers or teachers. But that foodie entrepreneurial side of us has never quite gone away. A final thing I'd like to tell you about my family is that we love to travel. And as far back as I can remember, as a child, we would go on family holidays each year. And these would happen in a fantastically mad way. Often, my parents would not have had the time, or actually, I don't know why it happened this way, but often my parents would not have booked anything except the hire car and the flight. Um, and maybe they'd have bought a guidebook as well if we were lucky. So we would land in Brisbane or in Johor in Malaysia. And we would land in a completely new location on a family holiday, and we'd get in the car. And my dad would have rounded up a bunch of flyers for various attractions at the airport. And then we would start figuring out where it was interesting to go. And bear in mind that this was in the days before Google Maps. So sometimes my older sister and I would have to learn to read a map and be the navigators just on the spot. And I think that probably about once every family holiday, we would end up driving around the city at about 9 o'clock at night looking for a hotel. But always in the end, something would come up. Maybe we'd stumble across a guest house run by an elderly couple. Once a bed and breakfast that was actually shut took us in a blizzard. And in years of family holidays, we've never had to sleep in the car. And although this is not the way I choose to holiday now, there was always a spontaneity to my childhood holidays growing up that meant we discovered some really wonderful things as we went along. Whether that was driving past a pick your own raspberry farm and deciding to go there, or finding a fabulous trout fishing spot where they would grill what you'd caught on the spot for you. Just different experiences that we would never have had if we'd planned out in great detail all the kind of star attractions to go to. So from a very young age, in my parents' funny way, I was exposed to this idea of having adventures, and having a basic level of confidence that you could take a risk and that it would work out. With my family's love of travel, it was then no surprise that when I turned 19, I decided to go abroad and came to Britain to do my degree at Warwick University in Coventry. And my family are Christians, so I'd grown up going to Sunday school. But by the time I was heading to uni, I'd had a personal encounter with God, and I'd given my life to him. And I was determined to do something with my life that would honor and reflect God. So when I finished uni, I worked for my church for a while as their student worker, welcoming international students to Coventry and sharing the gospel with them. And it was a great privilege to meet people from so many different backgrounds and to see some of them come to faith. And as part of the requirements of my job, I had to also reapply for a visa to stay in Britain every few years. And this continued for the next decade, even though I was more and more coming to see Britain as my home and my church community as family. As a tent making job alongside the student work, I started to work for different charities and churches as their grant fundraiser. And I eventually kind of accidentally set up a consultancy as a way to organize all of the different client charities that I was working for. So that was my first experience of business, and it went actually surprisingly well. And that fundraising consultancy is in fact still going today, although I'm no longer involved in the day-to-day running of it. But as I moved into my late 20s, I found myself moving further and further from the world of work, from the world of the student world, the world of students, and itching for a new adventure. And this was in about 2016 and 2017 when the refugee crisis, particularly stemming from the conflict in Syria, was very much in the news. And as I watched footage of these lifeboats in the Mediterranean, I just kept feeling really, really heartbroken about it, and thinking, well, what can I do? So this was something that I was praying about, but for a long time, probably for about 12 or 18 months, I just felt that I couldn't do anything but pray. Um, Lots of Syrian families were being resettled in Coventry, but the friends that I knew who worked with them all had sort of what I thought of as specialist skills. So they were English teachers or social workers or counselors. And I thought to myself, I don't have any of those skills, so I'll just give. But this isn't something that I can really do much about. But of course, in the background, I was continuing to teach myself to bake and to make sourdough bread in particular. And then in December 2017, a friend of mine asked if I would teach a bread making workshop to some refugees in Coventry's supported housing project. So I went along just to see what their cooking workshops were like. And in the photo on the left was cooked some Eritrean chicken and rice by a very nice man who showed us the whole process. Um, and then I said yes and went along and taught this bread making workshop and brought my doughs and my proving baskets. And a couple of women turned up who'd recently arrived from Syria and who really didn't speak much English at all. But I found that I could communicate with them because I would show them how I shaped my dough, and then they would say but, and then they would show me how they shaped theirs and what their different techniques were. So even though they didn't speak much English at all, we had a kind of conversation. And these women also recognized the number of the items that I had brought with me. So I pulled out my proving basket to show them. And one of them turned to her friend and said something in Arabic. And it turned out that she'd had a very similar basket back home in Syria in her kitchen. So this was a big realization for me at the time that these women actually were already very skilled bakers. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that the women that I had met didn't just want to sort of come to a bread making hobby group. They really wanted to work. And in Coventry, the situation was that there were a number of very good first response type services to welcome refugee families when they first arrived. So to kind of show them their new home, a caseworker would make sure that their children were enrolled in school, that they were registered with the GP, they were plugged into English classes, how to count out change to get on the bus and so on. But I was meeting women who had been in the country for 18 months, 24 months, sometimes 5 or even 10 years, who had sort of figured out the basics to get by, but who were still unemployed, who faced language and cultural barriers and juggled childcare and household commitments, and who all desperately wanted to work. And I also I tried to read up on refugee unemployment to find out as much as I could, and discovered that employment is, according to some studies, the number one factor in the successful integration of refugees into a new country. And yet, the unemployment rate for refugees in Britain was about 2 out of every 3. So the more I looked into it, the more this just seemed like an injustice on a personal level for the refugees, and an injustice for the new countries, a missed opportunity to tap into some of the skills and resilience that refugees had brought with them. So I started to think about whether a bakery would be possible, and put myself onto a social enterprise incubator program for food ideas called Feeding the City. So that's the first session of Feeding the City in that picture on the right. And feeding the city persuaded me very dangerously that in order to work out whether our idea was good or not, I really needed to run a pilot. And they gave us some funding to do this. So we we started to test out the idea of running a bakery in a small church kitchen on the east side of Coventry, and said to ourselves that we would run a 6-week pilot and we wanted to test whether any women would actually come to our training program, firstly. Secondly, whether anyone would actually buy sourdough loaves that we'd made. And thirdly, whether the kitchen space was suitable. And being very, very green to this, never having run a food business before, we saw loads and loads of ways in which God's grace just kind of helped us when we could have made serious mistakes, but they didn't happen. So in the photograph on the left, that's one of the examples. You can see that that's our 30-kilogram bread mixer. And on the day that it arrived, we realized that we really only had one spot in the church kitchen where we were baking for this mixer. And we hadn't measured it. So the mixer arrived and we thought, I don't actually know if it's going to fit. And we shoved it into place under the counter where it had to go. And it fit by about 2 millimeters. So we took that as a sign that God possibly wanted the bakery to exist and carried on. And at the end of our pilot, we'd set ourselves a target of wanting to sell 20 loaves a week. And at the end of our pilot, we were selling 34. 2 refugee women, entirely by word of mouth, had come to us and completed the pilot training program. And we were getting along very, very well with our landlord, to the point where we still bake in that same kitchen today, 2 years later. So it seemed like it was all systems go. And that made us start to think about our model for how to distribute the bread. And that led me to think, well, what relationships, what networks do I already have in Coventry? So in the top right-hand photo, that's my friend Arthur. Arthur is a vicar at a different church in Coventry. He's holding a tea towel there, and I don't really know why. But he very kindly allowed us to run our first bread tasting with his congregation. This was all pre-COVID, back in 2018, after Sunday morning worship. And out of that came the idea of selling bread subscriptions through churches in Coventry. And the thinking was that I'd spoken to a number of artisan bakeries that had started out and found it very, very difficult to cover their overheads. Often they had more space than they knew what to do with when they first started, and nobody knew about them, so nobody was buying from them. But they already had to pay rent and utilities on all the space that they had. And so we were thinking to ourselves, we want to put as much of our proceeds, as much of what we earn into training and employing refugee women as we possibly can. So we don't want to be saddled with a huge overhead that we struggle to meet from the start. And so we thought, okay, well, I know what we'll do. Let's sell things online and we'll work to find a church, which we had already found at this point, that would host us in their kitchen on weekdays. But the other piece of the puzzle was thinking perhaps we could sell bread subscriptions that would distribute it through the churches. And then we wouldn't need a shop front for people to come and browse and look around at our loaves and then make up their minds about what to buy. If people at churches were buying a weekly or a fortnightly or a monthly loaf, it would enable us to predict our cash flow so that we would know we would have quite a clear idea from the start about how many women we could afford to train and employ. And it would be convenient for people attending those churches because the churches are open, well, pre-COVID anyway, the churches are open at the same time on a Sunday every week. And if you're there, then you pick up your loaf. And if you're not, you can always pause your subscription and roll it over to the next week. So we started selling these bread subscriptions. And then as numbers grew, we're able to launch the bakery in September 2018. So that's on that photo on the left is of our first taster day with a cohort of 6 refugee women who came and looked at what we were doing and thought that they would like to join in. And on the right, that's the website that we launched. And so after about 10 weeks of training and selling loaves, we were able to graduate our first trainees from our cohort. So that lady in the left hand photo is our first training graduate, who's now become our head of kitchen. And we threw the training graduates a tea party, which you can see in the photo on the right, that their children were quite enthralled by. Yeah, so that was the beginning of the bakery. And we carried on training cohorts of refugee women and selling the loaf subscriptions online for people to collect. And gradually over time, our number of collection points grew to about 13 across Coventry, including churches, but also restaurants, cafes, offices. And we started to think that this might be a good model for starting a bakery that trains and employs a group of vulnerable individuals. And so we started to think about replicating the bakery model to other cities as well. And that is described by these photographs of us attending an event with the Cinnamon Network, where we were selected to be part of their incubator program to replicate the project to different cities. So we have been going now for about 2 years and a bit, since autumn 2018. And in that time, we diversified from loaf subscriptions to also we've ramped up our wholesale trade to restaurants and cafes. We've gained new customers from selling at markets and launched a line of cakes and sweet buns as well. We've been teaching online baking classes. So yeah, so the bakery is now founded on a number of different income streams. And obviously in the COVID era, we've had to alter what we do quite significantly to carry on. So instead of offering collection across Coventry at public buildings, we've switched into doing home deliveries. And although our wholesale trade has dried up completely because of restaurants and cafes, many of them being shut, the other thing that we've started to do is to offer our customers the chance to donate their loaf subscription to Food Bank. And this is something that's been really, really popular. I think there's a recognition that the economic impact of COVID will be serious and lasting, and particularly among our group of customers, there's a strong feeling of wanting to do something to help. So in the last year, we've begun to, we've seen an ever increasing desire to donate loaves to Food Bank each week. And we're now sending Food Bank about 500 loaves a week, which means that every emergency food parcel that Coventry Food Bank give out can have a loaf of Proof Bakery bread in it. So moving on. Yeah, so I think that when I started this bakery, it was out of a sort of itch to do something new that came out of my interests and also out of my sense of injustice in the refugee crisis. But what I didn't anticipate was the friendships and the teamwork that would happen with the women that I've gotten to know. And so I'd like to finish by telling you some of their stories. So this is Linda, and she actually came on our very first pilot. And when she came to us, she had been in Coventry, in this country, for barely 6 months. And she didn't dare to travel across Coventry on the bus by herself. But over the course of our pilot, she learned to get on the bus by herself, and now she's able to travel about independently in Coventry. This is Chen. And when she came to us, she said that the only thing she had ever put in her oven at home was pizza, and it only ever came out one of two ways, either raw or burnt. But when she joined us, she learned to make sourdough recipes from scratch, and she now bakes them regularly at home for her family. This is Hayat, who was a graduate from our very first training cohort. And she has gone from strength to strength in the time that she's been with us. So since graduating, when she graduated, she was actually offered a job with a local Kurdish corner shop just 2 minutes from her house, as a baker. But after about 2 weeks of working with them, which we were delighted for her about, she came back to the bakery and said, Chernise, I don't want to work in this Kurdish corner shop, even though I am Kurdish, because they only speak Kurdish and I'll never improve my English if I stick with them. Do you think I could have a job? So she was one of the first bakers that we were able to employ. And since she's been with us, she has passed her driving test on the first go and bought a car, which is very useful, as you might imagine, when you've got 3 children and are a single mum. She has also gone up 2 levels in her English. She's been promoted to a shift supervisor in the bakery. Last summer, she was able, after some saving up, to take her kids to visit their extended family in Iraq, whom she hadn't seen for 4 years. And most recently, we've also asked if she will start to train some of the new women coming into our bakery. So she's now training women who started off in the same place as her 3 years ago. So all of these wonderful experiences of working with these women in Proof Bakery have really come out of knowing something of who I am and where I've come from. And I think on reflection, I don't just mean in the generic sense of, I'm a child of God, which is so important to know, of course, but in the sense of knowing specifically what shape I am. So what my family is like, what my interests are, what experiences have shaped me, and using those to kind of follow my nose into creating this new thing. And I think what I don't want you to take from this is, oh, it's all very well if you have a family that enjoys food and travel. It's not about being the same as me, but it's rather about who you are. And so I've got a few questions that I would like us to think about just to finish off at the end. Firstly, how would you describe your family? So I think of my family as being foodies, as being entrepreneurial. How would you describe yours? Maybe you'd like to just take a couple of seconds to write down some top line descriptions that come to mind for you. And then my second question is, what are the childhood experiences, both good and maybe not so good, that have shaped you? And again, maybe take a few moments to jot those down. And then my third question is there an experience of injustice that moves you to anger or to activism? So, in the same way that I had this sort of quite visceral gut reaction to seeing footage of these lifeboats in the Mediterranean, is there something that deeply moves you that you think I must do something about that? And I'm aware that these are really big questions, so you're probably not going to kind of comprehensively write something down in response to them in the time that we've got, but hopefully you'll be able to keep thinking about them after this session. So my final question is, given these your answers to the three questions that you've already jotted down, what could it look like to take these experiences that have shaped you and in some ways are still speaking to you today, and to turn them into something that does good in the world today? Okay. Um, I think that's about all that I've got for us today. But I would also like to answer Paul's question, and then I will ask if there are any other questions that have arisen from my talk. Um, so Paul's question says, "What surprised you most about your experience in starting up the bakery?" Um, and if I'm honest, I think it was the enormous spunk and courage of the women that we work with, um, and possibly that is a bit odd because to for these women to have come to Britain to make a new life for themselves, in a way you might expect that they are courageous and spunky, but I think I didn't know what that looked like until I met them, and saw the way in which they find ways to express themselves or to assert themselves, even if their command of English isn't very good. They're incredibly determined, and that sometimes that comes out in slightly odd ways. Like they do things that we wouldn't necessarily recommend that someone does to get themselves to the place where they want to go. But it's yeah, I've been deeply impressed by the determination of the women that I work with, to better themselves and to give their families a better life. Thank you very much for coming and listening to my story today. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.